sex is predominantly psychological.
Is there a way for this to be healthy?
Fetishization is a form of objectification.
Why are we kinky?
It's a way of transforming pain into pleasure.
You can call anyone daddy.
Absolutely, you can.
Or baby girl.
You want to swallow for me there? If you
ahead.
can hold it together, we'll give you a treat after.
I'm just a little dumb, but continue.
Do you want me to talk real slow?
Yeah, please.
Ooh, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Queer Collective Podcast. I'm your host, Carbon.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Pat.
And welcome to the show. And this podcast is presented by Vizzy Hard Seltzer and Field, but more on that later. Cheers.
Have you ever wondered what drives our most forbidden desires, or how you can start to explore the discreet world of kink? Well, you're in luck because today we're diving right in with an episode on Kink 101. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the psychology of kinks and fetishes, overcoming sexual shame, consent, where to get started, and we'll of course be chatting about play parties and sex clubs. Stay with us because this is going to be quite the conversation.
And our guest today is an academic, a lecturer, podcaster, and friend, Pat, who goes by Pat. They have a podcast called Intellectual Erection. They use he, they pronouns, has dedicated their work towards ethnographies of humans in sex-positive communities, psychology, and the intersection of the two. Their work explores themes of diversity in sexuality, sexual health, consent, sex worker rights, and alternative relationship models. Pat, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into our conversation around the psychology of kink, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the work that you've been doing.
I'm an academic, and at some point I wanted to kind of translate some of the stuff that I was doing in psychology for community members, specifically in the sex-positive community. So I started this podcast. I started Intellectual Erection. Did it for 4 years. I'm no longer doing it. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it was fun. It was very educational for me. I got to speak to so many humans in the sex positive communities, from people like doing kink to sex work, sex workers' rights, to polyamory, to all sorts of weirdos that I was so excited to get to know more about. And I think I'll pepper in some of the lessons I learned, I think, since we're talking about kink today. But yeah, I've lectured on this stuff as well. I've had guest lectures, I've had workshops, and it's been part of my way of like bringing my academic expertise into like a community setting that I care about.
Yeah, it's a world that we've definitely been diving into very recently. I think the catalyst for us was like meeting your partner, Yaz.
Really?
One of our, yes. You may not know this, but
You may not know them.
you may not know them very well, but your partner, Yaz, was on our podcast. And they're definitely a fan favorite. And they're one of our favorites because they've definitely opened up our world. And so have you, in terms of like the realm of kink and exploration and different relationship structures. And it's been definitely a fun exploration for us that we're excited to share with our listeners.
Well, shit. Yeah, it's going to be hard to follow.
The pressure's on.
First, we want to dive into the theme of the psychology of kink. Let's start real basic. What qualifies as kink and how does it differ from a fetish?
My go-to answer, and this is how I think about the difference between kinks and fetishes, I'm not really familiar with the arguments that are trying to say that they're kind of synonymous. For me, a kink is something that you just have a desire for. It's a taboo generally, right? That you have a desire for, while fetishes are things that you kind of need in order to experience sexual arousal. Right? So a kink is something you kind of choose. It can really arouse you, but you don't need it. Whereas a fetish is often described as a need for people to experience arousal or full gratification. And I think, and I'm not sure, I think the reason that there's some debate around it is because there might be an argument for saying that some people have fetishes that they don't need.
Interesting.
But they feel the same sort of intensity. Like, this thing gets me off so much,
Yeah.
but I don't absolutely
I can
need
come
it.
in another way.
So, yeah.
Many of us kind of have negative connotations with fetishes and like the kind of the fetishization of other people, maybe like turning them into a sexual object, a sexual conquest, not someone as you're seeing as a full person. Do you think it's possible to have a fetish, like you say, where it's like something that you need, but you're still able to see the people that you're engaging with as like a full person? Like, is there a way for this to be healthy?
The first thing I want to say to that is that fetishization is a form of objectification, specifically one where we sort of derive sexual arousal from transforming a person into a sort of object. And when you transform somebody into an object, you have a sort of instrumental relationship with them. What that means is you kind of see them like a tool
Right.
that you use for your particular ends without really concerns for the tool, because a tool is an object, and an object doesn't have emotions.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't have consent. An object is to be used. It can be discarded. And in this way, there's aspects of both fetishization and objectification that are unethical. Having said that, though, sometimes people want to feel objectified.
Right.
Sometimes people want to be fetishized. And the introduction of consent into this practice is what brings it out of that unethical territory, I think, to a place where we can ethically engage in it. For example, if you know somebody that you think is super cute and this person says, is it okay if I objectify you for a second? And you say, I find this person super attractive. I do want to feel objectified by this person, and you consent to it, then that person can say, okay, well, I think that this part of your body is best I've ever seen, or it does something for me that I've never experienced before, or I'm like super attracted to the shape of your lips, right? Like anything like that is a form of objectification. I think to fetishize somebody can similarly be done with consent. And I think in the areas where we don't do it with consent is where we run into a lot of problems. And there's definitely a bunch of fetishization and fetishes that cross the line. And I think one notable one is race play.
Right.
Which I've also interviewed people on my podcast about. And it's a sticky territory because that one, even with consent, can be a little bit hard to understand where that consent is coming from, at least for me.
What arguments have you heard that in their minds sort of like makes it okay?
It's just an extreme taboo. So we're going to be talking about taboos today a lot, and we'll get into why those things are so exciting. But this being a very sort of extreme taboo rooted in something that is not only historically unethical, but contemporarily unethical is the problem, because you're not just tapping into something that once was, you're tapping into something that still is. So my concern is like, if I'm a person of color and I consensually engage in race play, then am I doing this because I want to be part of the community and I don't fully appreciate the risks that I'm putting myself at by potentially encountering something traumatic? Or am I fully like aware of all the consequences and I've actually don't feel like this will hurt me in psychological ways? And there's like a way that I find this really erotic. In the discussions I've had with people around it, I think that people who are for sort of like race play fetish stuff are trying to make the argument that in exploring it through consent, we can kind of unravel some of the sticky bits. But again, I also think that that could be dangerous because now you're talking about therapy, and sex is not therapy, kink is not therapy. Therapy is therapy.
Yeah.
And if you're not a professional and you're not able to hold space for somebody in that way, then I don't know if it's a good territory to like dive into.
That's interesting because I have seen that kind of argument come up quite a bit where it's like people explore kinks through past traumas occasionally. And in some ways I'm now playing with consensual non-consent, and that is interesting. It is possible to like bring up triggers. I haven't dove in deep enough into it to like fully see where I am with it, or if it's like a positive experience or a negative experience. It's just something I've been like thinking about and like slightly dipping my toes into. But would you say that's like a bad idea to do if you have past traumas?
I can't say if it's a bad idea to do. What I heard you say is that you've done therapy to work on the trauma. And you've come to a place where you feel safe enough to engage in this in an erotic way that could make you feel really good.
With people you trust.
Exactly. With people you trust, and that you know your triggers, and that if you establish parameters of consent going in with the other person, then it could be a very gratifying experience for you. I think there's risk in all sorts of kink, in sex in general. You know, safe sex practices is safer sex practices for a reason. So I think it's the same situation here. And in your example here, it sounds like you've done a lot of the work to get to a place where you feel comfortable doing this stuff. So in the same way, I think that if somebody made the case for other really taboo kinks like this, like race play, then it'd be up to them to assume that risk and freely choose it and take the responsibility for themselves in that situation with the other person that they're doing it with.
Speaking of taboo, why are we kinky?
Why are we kinky? So I think that kinks and fetishes could represent repressed material that then resurfaces through secondary defense mechanisms. So Freud famously said that your primary defense mechanism is repression. You take content that is unacceptable for you to experience consciously because it's too painful, and then you repress it into the unconscious. This is an automatic process. Defense mechanisms operate unconsciously, so you're not really aware. And this often happens in childhood. And then those desires still linger there. They still exist, and they still exert an unconscious energy, right? So that needs to go somewhere. And it tends to find release valves through secondary defense mechanisms, which will be things like projection, rationalization, sublimation. So you've heard a lot of these, denial, right? So for example, if somebody is experiencing, let's say, homosexual desire in a society that's highly homophobic, if we know any, then that is repressed. And one of the secondary defense mechanisms could be denial. I'm not gay. Projection. No, you're gay. Right. Stuff like that. There's a lot of ways where I think that taboo material, which is technically stuff that is inappropriate and relating to desires, gets repressed in these ways, and then it resurfaces. I think it's our ways of kind of coping with emotionally difficult material, and it's a way of transforming pain into pleasure, or finding a little bit of pleasure within pain, right? Kind of like the masochist. It allows the desire to find a bit of an outlet, and for us to not just experience the pain of it and the shame and the guilt and all the uncomfortable feelings, but to find a little bit of pleasure. So then that way you both get the release of all this pent up material through a source that's also pleasurable, or you turn that into a pleasurable source.
Would you be able to give an example kind of along those lines of a past like repressed experience and then like how that transforms into like a specific kink?
Some of this stuff will happen early in childhood. So you'll have something that you see on TV or that you experience and it looks dangerous and you're getting feelings about it and you don't know why. And I've had people on my podcast talk about all sorts of first kind of sexual awakenings. It was like one of my questions that I would ask. And a lot of it was like, oh, I saw something on TV, or I opened a magazine and it was inappropriate. Or somebody said, I watched a cartoon where this like woman was tied to a railroad track and was aroused, right? So there's something there about this dangerous situation in which you are trapped in a maybe erotic situation, but it's not your fault. You see? So like it brings you into the position of having the desire without taking the responsibility for it. It's not my fault that I'm here. I'm trapped. I'm tied down and whatever. And then later on, you can develop that into a kink, into a desire that you exercise through consent. So kinks can be built out of experiences. They could also be built out of things that would otherwise be traumatic. There was a story that I had with one of the people I interviewed on my podcast. It was the only time I was able to talk to somebody who was a cuckold. I think it was my favorite interview that I did because he described the whole situation and how he got into it. And it made so much sense. He said he was dating somebody and this person, I think, either cheated on him or like went to sleep with someone else, or he walked in on it and it was just like a very painful experience. Part of the way of dealing with that painful experience was to eroticize it, to give it a sort of like pleasurable outlet, which then turned into him craving being cuckolded by his current partner while he's watching and psychologically immobilized because she's telling him, you can't, you won't, you can do this, but not that. And for him, he said every single time that it happens, it's always terrifying, always visceral, and always highly erotic.
Interesting.
So it's like fear, arousal, always happening.
But is this his way of like taking control of a situation that he once couldn't control?
Yeah.
You mentioned masochist as part of like us sort of exploring like taboo and kink and like having desires in that way because of like maybe what we experienced subconsciously or from previous trauma or whatever else. When it comes to being a sadist, do you think it comes from like the same place, like out of fear or trauma or like something that you don't want to become in like your everyday life, but you can like, I don't know, explore it or experience it with consent?
So I think that something like sadism, which goes into the area of like dominance and domination and maybe even topping in general, that could be associated with feelings of insecurity It could be associated with a lack of self-control or a strong need for control. So people who might have these experiences early in childhood or later in life could then see this as an outlet for them to have control and to be able to use it in ways that are gratifying and ways that are consensual.
The period in my life where I started exploring BDSM was a period where so many things felt really chaotic and out of control. So you bringing up kind of that element of control really does resonate, because I found, even whether it was like doming or subbing, in both instances, I felt like, if we're talking about subbing, I felt like the loss of control, letting go and like just feeling like really intense pain. Like during that period of time, I could withstand a lot more pain than I can now when things are feeling a lot more healed, which is kind of interesting, but it felt like a form of escapism a little bit. And then with doming, it felt like, like regaining control over like a life that was feeling really out of control. And both of them, I definitely felt like were tools that were helping me get through it. I'm not sure if it was totally healthy. Like, I think I was a little bit reckless at the period of time, which is like kind of tying back into it's like, should we be exploring things in that way? I don't know. Maybe focus on some other like self-care practices as well. But yeah, I don't know. No regrets.
And I've been there myself too. Like in the part where I was feeling most emotional pain, I could put my body through anything. I ran marathons. I like did triathlons. I was doing crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And didn't drink water.
I told you that in confidence. I also mentioned, insecurity and like lack of control, perhaps when you were a child and not feeling like you had things in control, could develop into like a kink for dominance and topping. Insecure attachment in early childhood could convert into CGL dynamics, caregiver little dynamics. Let me finish, Yao.
Oh, damn. I'm just going to go now.
Yeah,
Caregiver little?
Caregiver little. So in this...
She relates to the little part.
I may be tall, but I'm actually just little.
I used to do workshops on this.
Huh?
I used to do workshops on this. All right. I don't know why I said that. I was trying to correct myself because the first time I said war shops. So it used to be called DDLG, right? Daddy, Dom, Little Girl.
Okay.
And you might have some inclinations about why it might be changed to CGL, caregiver little. It's not very inclusive language in the first iteration, and it kind of gives primacy to dominant daddies and little girls.
You can call anyone daddy.
Absolutely, you can.
Or baby girl.
But the dynamics of the people, like the actual people that would show up to these workshops,
it
were
was like very hetero.
pretty typical.
Yeah,
I see.
Older dudes, younger girls.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's age play involved in that. There's a whole bunch of taboo territory there. And my entire workshop on this was like, let's talk about the ethics of this thing. The tendency to want to give care to somebody else could come from insecure attachment. You know how I know that? Insecure attachment, caregiver tendencies. Yeah. Like I like to do things for people. But again, speculative. This is not science. It's not a causal relationship. But it does make sense. One can make a compelling argument for this. One thing I noticed is that a lot of the littles...
I gotta go. It's what I call myself.
You wanna what? Little yourself?
It's what she calls herself.
If you can hold it together, we'll give you a treat after.
I say it in like a non-sexual way. That's why it's kind of funny right now.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Daddy and I will give you a treat later.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, on the one hand, you have caregivers who might have this tendency from a place of insecure attachment. And then with littles, I've noticed that some littles...
Stop it.
That's your word, huh? Littles. Some littles have a tendency to be people who also have BPD.
What's BPD?
Borderline personality disorder.
I knew that.
These people with BPD, I feel for them because they don't have access to many resources to help with this a very complex set of symptoms that are classified as this one disorder, but it's symptoms from so many other disorders, right? Emotional dysregulation, all or nothing thinking, sometimes dissociation and the inability to process things, inability to take criticism. These can result in a lot of the kinds of behaviors that might make up like a bratty little. If you want to stereotype a bratty little, it could be somebody who behaves in these sorts of ways. So I think that sometimes people navigate to these roles because it makes sense for them, because it's spaces where they can exercise being themselves without being ostracized. So if you have a tendency and you want to give and you want to take care of somebody in sometimes infantilizing way that includes age play, this might be a place for you. And if you're somebody with BPD, or maybe you don't have BPD and you just want to behave like any age range of like baby to toddler to adolescent without being ostracized, this might be the place for you. But my approach to this has been like, let's talk about the ethics of it, because like going into this is risky territory, and coming out of this kind of relationship is also very, challenging and can exacerbate existing mental health concerns and can provoke things like depression and can be really hard because it also promotes often codependency.
My next question for you. This one's one that I'm interested to hear your response on, but without shame around taboo sexual desires, would our desire for them lessen?
It's funny that you asked that because I have a joke about this. All of us being so fucked up and being kinky weirdos and with therapy culture and all this growth and all this stuff that we're learning and consent and communication, the next generation, like our kids, not mine because I won't have any, but like our kids, it's communal kids.
Yeah.
Our kids are going to be vanilla as fuck.
Yeah.
Right? That's the joke because they won't have traumas to process into erotic kinks.
I mean, like the world is burning as we speak. Kinks will come out of like some sort of like nature play.
Environmental kink.
Environmental
play.
kinks.
Yeah.
Political kinks.
We'll see what
Political
happens.
kinks. Fuck your politicians.
This is sponsored by
This is sponsored by
the government of Canada. But before we get into that, this episode is sponsored by Field.
Field is a dating app for the curious and those who love comedy. At their ongoing comedy show called One Night Stand Up, Field encourages their comedians to spit it out.
Field is my favorite app. It really is. Because I'm like discovering what my kink is, and I feel totally comfortable. Every interaction I've had has been great. The other apps, you'll just get messaged by some dude who's just like, hey, want to come over? Get yourself an Uber. And then you like go to his place and he chokes you without asking. Like fully clothed, you're not even kissing yet. He's just like, yeah. What? I thought you'd like it. What? You can't just assume someone's kink by looking at them. Like, yes, I'm into that, but like that... But you can't assume that.
According to Field, to spit means to speak your deepest desires into existence. And on Field, people are doing just that. Case in point, 1 in 2 people on Field have a kink. No matter where you are in your journey, exploring your desires can feel scary at first. To do so, you need 2 things: a space you feel comfortable in and a community that understands you. If you've been looking for both, you'll find them IRL at a one-night stand-up comedy show and on the Field app. To get access to Field's comedy shows, which are exclusive and free to all Field members, and other IRL events, download the app. That's FEELD.
Thank you, Field, for sponsoring this episode.
Hold that thought because this podcast is proudly sponsored by Vizzy Hard Seltzer.
That's right. And the ones that we were drinking in this episode is from their new launch, which is Vizzy Hard Seltzer Max, now with 7% alcohol. And they have vibrant new flavors like papaya pineapple, dragon fruit mango, blueberry white peach, and passion fruit kiwi.
Love it. And they all taste super good. And as always, we recommend if you are a hard seltzer drinker that you support a brand that you know also supports the queer community. And now back to the episode.
I think we do have enough taboo desires and dynamics that exist without shame. So I don't think shame is a necessary component for us to have taboos, right? So one of the typical ones, like when we talk about domination and submission, this comes from the master-slave dialectic, which is rooted in slavery. And it is unethical. It's rooted in oppression. But that's also what makes it taboo, which is then what also makes it possible to eroticize and to have these sorts of dynamics. And when we fully understand them, we don't experience shame in those instances, but we do still experience the arousal associated with the taboo content. The taboo desire itself is ethically impermissible. You don't need the shame for that.
Ethically impermissible.
Unethical.
Okay.
Thank you for
It's the long form.
the ones that are dumb over here.
I'm just a little dumb, but continue.
Ooh, bimbofication. So yeah, like physical, emotional pain will still exist without shame. Like I said, we turn this pain into our advantage by formulating it either through pleasure or converting it into pleasure. You know the story of Sisyphus?
Repeat it for everybody.
Sisyphus is condemned by the gods.
Repeat it for the bimbo.
No problem. Do you want me to talk real slow?
Yeah, please.
So Sisyphus.
Okay.
He is condemned by the gods.
Okay.
They're like, you've been a bad boy, Sisyphus. So we're going to condemn you to an eternity of pushing a boulder up this mountain. Once you get to the tip,
Just the tip.
Wink.
it's going to roll back down. And you're going to have to do it again. And then Sisyphus just keeps pushing this boulder up the mountain. and then it rolls back down. And then Albert Camus, who wrote about the myth of Sisyphus, existential philosopher, he says we must imagine him happy, okay, which is like kind of absurd.
Yeah.
Right? Like you have this life that's meaningless, but how could you be happy?
To me, it's immediately no. What do you mean?
Camus' logic in this is that Sisyphus is condemned to pushing the boulder, but the gods can't condemn him how to feel about it. So he still has the freedom and consciousness over his attitude. And what is the most defiant thing you can do in that situation but smile and enjoy it?
Ah,
Yeah.
Right?
he is a naughty boy.
Maybe get a boner.
Right? To have no control over our fate, we still have control over our attitudes. And this is an exercise in human freedom. Shame, I think, then only inhibits that possibility for exercising our kinks and fetishes from this place of freedom. And without the shame, we could then fully kind of accept the freedom and responsibility for our desires. So if anything, there's a good argument to be made that if we didn't have shame, we could have a healthier relationship with kinks and fetishes. And it would eliminate many of the consequences. So like some people might go into the kinks and fetishes and be like, I really want to try this. And then they try it. And afterwards they're like, wow, I felt violated. And that's because I had unprocessed trauma around, shame and around this and that. And I think the healthier version of that is being more aware of the things that what we want and freely making those decisions, accepting the responsibilities that come with it.
Yeah, I feel like I relate to that specifically in like a submissive sort of role. Submitting in general to me feels like loss of control. It feels like loss of like autonomy and like shameful in a way. And I really think about like why I feel that way, because it is in an environment every single time where like I trust the other person. There's nobody like laughing at me or anything like that. So it's like, where is that coming from? Where is like the power struggle coming from, or like the shame coming from, or the desire for control coming from? Still unpacking that. But like psychologically, I think it's something that I would potentially like to overcome and get to a place where I feel like more comfortable with it.
So I think you're asking the right questions there for yourself, is like, why do I feel this inhibition to be submissive? Maybe there's something in there that was implicit in what you said. Maybe it scares you. I think that's a good thing to try to tap into. Maybe why does this scare me, or why does this make me feel uncomfortable? Potentially seeing if this is something that needs resolution. Because maybe there's something there that, would feel liberating afterwards.
Most likely.
Right.
But I think it also does like, just the first thing that I can think of is like my outer appearance and like persona that like sort of people see me as, and like not wanting to like break that, I don't know, mask reputation, you could call it, of like, I am a mask, I am a top, and I don't want anybody to think differently, and like if you did think differently, like would you think less of me?
And I think we're in this period where we're still kind of figuring shit out in terms of like gender norms and roles and identities, right? Because there's like the stereotype version of being mask, strong, but there's also lots of toxicity.
Of course.
And replicating that can be erotic, but it can also find ways to be problematic by limiting your possibilities.
Totally.
And then there's versions of masculinity that are very submissive, very subservient, very kind of passive, And there's, I think, possibilities to explore that as a genuine aspect of masculinity that doesn't call into question the identity itself. It just like shows nuance for the many possibilities within.
Yeah, I struggle with that too, because like at the same time I don't want to lessen my femininity. They're pulling each other in different directions, and I'm like, where's the middle line, and like where do I feel comfortable to sit in? And like I think I'm still finding that, especially when it comes to sexual scenarios.
Yeah, but it also sounds to me like you're very open and you're very curious.
I am.
Right.
Yeah.
So that sort of openness and curiosity, I think, is a really good indicator that you got this, bro. You're gonna figure it out.
Thanks, dude.
Yeah, like you're on the path. So it's just like it's about figuring out the nuances, the things that make sense for you, and like how it's gonna look for you. And maybe you'll come to this place where you're like, yeah, I don't like submission. It's not my thing. I got to a place where I could safely explore without feeling like my whole identity was in crisis, and I still like topping.
Yeah.
Or now I'm a switch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's actually getting hot in here. I'm going to
Oh.
outfit change.
For anybody watching the podcast, it got hot in here.
Pat just took off his theirs jacket. Okay, so for folks like Carbon and for other people maybe who were raised in religious environments where there's a lot of sexual shame, what do you recommend people do to start to overcome that type of shame and start to enjoy the kink world?
It's a tough question because I don't know if there is like a sort of cookie cutter go-to answer for overcoming shame in general. Never mind like specifically like indoctrinated forms of shame. I think this could be really challenging to undo, and you have to maybe start by looking at when they're triggered. So when is this happening for me? Am I getting triggered only when I'm doing this activity, or is it during any kind of sexual activity? Try to think about what is the association with the trigger. What are you thinking of when this is happening? Are you remembering somebody in particular that's telling you, no, this is bad? Are you remembering a past trauma that's saying, when you did this before, when you first were aroused by this, there were horrible consequences, right? And once there's a bit of that processing done, I think the best answer, to be honest, is therapy in these instances, because most of the time you are dealing with something that's complex and that potentially gets into traumatic territory. Diving into kink as like a way to liberate yourself is risky. It could work out, but there's so many ways it might not. And in that process, you could also end up hurting yourself and other people too. Slowly unpacking that with yourself until you feel safe enough to explore these things in other ways. And I think that therapeutic support is integral to this. And I think there are sex therapists out there who are specially trained in these situations so that you don't just assume you're safe to try. You feel safe to try, and you have somebody supporting you through that process and on the way out. In talking about shame specifically, it's also important to know sometimes where this stuff is coming from, right? And we need good education, first of all. We need good education and accurate information. And as we know, like sex ed programs have been ravaged by conservative politicians to this like skeleton of a program, if any.
Terrible.
So I think part of like destigmatizing our desires and sexuality is important for like healthy, consensual, and thriving sex lives. The source of shame around it, I think, comes from us having developed a science of sex. And this comes from Michel Foucault. He wrote this book called The History of Sexuality. It's actually like 4 books, but this won 4 books. In the first of which he gives an outline of the history of how sexuality became a science. And he says a lot of people think that the sexuality was, or sex and sexuality were repressed. People didn't talk about it. He's like, that's actually false. People talked a lot about it. The problem is that it went from this area where your sexual confessions, which were done in the church, right, for which you'd have to repent, was a sort of moral model under which the science of sexuality was developed so that we can understand anatomical parts and procreation. And developing a science of sexuality is rather sterile. It tells us the things to avoid, like STIs. It tells us, what body parts do. It tells us like biology, and it focuses entirely on procreation. Yeah. He says, by contrast, look at the societies that have had an art of sexuality. He points to Rome. He points to the Middle East. He points to China. He points to Japan. He points to India. All ancient civilizations where they had an art of sex. Where to understand sex, you start from pleasure, not from anatomy, not from biology. In a society such as ours, which is dominated in North America, Western Europe, and whatnot, and even globally now by a science of sexuality, is it still possible for us to create an art of sex and sexuality? And moreover, these ancient civilizations included things like group sex, super gay stuff in almost all of them.
Not just regular gay stuff. That's for sure.
Super gay stuff.
Super gay stuff.
I think that's a nice proposition. I think that's something we can work towards. And the first part is like looking at the history of shame. And the history of shame is built into the science of sex. It's built into it from its religious origins. And it carries this overtone that sex is a shameful thing that only has a biological purpose, which is also heteronormative. Right?
Yeah. Going back to our Queer Animals podcast, it also does go against nature, the way that we've constructed sex to be now as a society.
I didn't hear that podcast. Did you guys talk about the lesbian seagulls?
Lesbian albatrosses, yes. Yeah. But there's also like for example, like dolphins.
Oh, yeah.
They form a group of like 2 or 3 dolphins and they have sex 2.3 times per hour? Gay sex.
Yeah.
Dolphins are they're on
Super
it.
gay.
Yeah.
They're super gay. But like, for example, if we think about like bonobos, like chimpanzees, like our closest relatives, they have group sex all the time. And it's to like build bonds, and it's to be like, oh, I missed you so much. Let's have group sex now.
I miss you so much.
Do it now.
All of us missed you.
Now is the time.
Okay. This next section that we're going to get into is around introduction to kinks for all of our viewers who are new here. So if anyone out there, not me,
Could be.
never, it would never be me. But if someone asked you, Pat, they called you by your name. They said Pat.
They must know me.
And they said, I'm really interested in exploring the world of kink, but I don't know where to start. What would you recommend that they do?
If you're interested in exploring the world of kink, I would suggest you read.
What should I read?
What should you read?
Not me. They.
They, them.
They, he, they, she, they.
Honestly, I think books on kink and fetishes are. I haven't found any that I would recommend at this
So don't
point.
read.
Well, what I read are like journal articles, but they tend to be a little bit more science-y, and they're not always exciting. I do think that specifically for kinks and fetishes, there's a lot more contemporary, good, useful information online. You can find pro-doms that have probably podcasts and videos and all sorts of information. So once you know what's out there, then you kind of know maybe what you're interested in. Ask some questions of people that you know that are practicing kinks or that are involved in a sort of kinky lifestyle or professionally involved in kinks. You could go to Munches. I know FetLife. If anybody doesn't know, FetLife is like the Facebook for BDSM, the BDSM community.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is like the greatest place on earth, but it is a central place that will have things like Munches in your city where you can go to a bar and meet up with a bunch of weirdos that want to talk about kink. And that could be like a entry level way to get in there because it's a social and it's not a play party, right? Then you can attend kink workshops, seminars, or events. These can be held at certain sex clubs, or maybe you can find ones in your area that are done by certain community members. If you could find a reliable mentor, that would be really good. Yeah, that's what I'd say. And then like, don't start practicing things without first knowing what the activity is, what's safe to use, what's not safe to use, and how to generally engage in a scene with anybody. When you get into a scene with somebody who's experienced, they're going to ask you a bunch of questions. And depending on the activity you want to do, they might not do it with you. If you want to be suspended and it's your first time getting tied, if you find somebody who's willing to do that, you probably shouldn't do it. You have to build up to certain things, and responsible people who practice any sort of BDSM will ask you questions about your physical health, about medications, about triggers, right? About mental health things that could come up, about what aftercare looks like for you, about safety, right? So all of these things have to come into place. Circulation's important, especially if you're getting tied up and things like that. You don't know what you don't know. And then experimenting on other people is neither ethical nor safe.
The way that we started like dabbling in it, I definitely wish that I had done more research on things before I had just like chaotically dove in. I found one thing that was like really fun and helpful. Going to Oasis on like usual most nights, they'll have demonstrations and those kinds of things. And that's how the two of us kind of started learning things, is just by like seeing a professional dom demonstrate things. And like that sparked our interest. Even like going to a sex club for the first time and just like watching with your partner, I think is like a good way to get started without like getting into a place where you might be uncomfortable. It's like, okay, we're just gonna go together and like watch and like see what we like. Maybe kiss a little, you know, and like do like check in with each other.
Just a
Maybe.
little.
I don't know, maybe. So I feel like that's kind of when people ask me like, where do you think I should start? That's usually what I say is like, go, but like don't go with too many expectations, and like start with learning and education. The next one I want to ask actually is kind of tied to this. I'm wondering, what are the most common mistakes you see people making when first entering into the kink world?
Diving into the deep end first, right? I know you're excited. That's how everybody who's kind of gets into the kink community ends up there, is because they're excited. I know there's this mentality like high risk, high reward. So you want to try things that are, you know, challenging, and you want to push your boundaries and somebody else's maybe.
Yeah.
But that is ripe territory for making mistakes, which could consequently lead you to bowing out of trying other things. So it could end your kink journey. Worse maybe is ending somebody else's or causing trauma for somebody else. Or you've done a little bit of certain kinks and activities and then you think, oh, I'm ready for edge play. Any edge play is like something that's on the edge of being quite risky. That could include knife play, CNC, certain kinds of choking, right?
Yeah, because you could actually very dangerously hurt someone. Now that I know you to be a very creative role player, you and your Kuel did like a really creative performance at our Halloween party, and you were the mastermind behind it. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how someone can get more creative with their own role play.
I think there's two things there. One is recognizing that all sex is fantasy. Put a pin in that. Okay. The other is recognizing that sex is predominantly psychological. And that's because you can't experience the conscious state of another person, right? So anytime you're having sex with somebody, whether it's vanilla or not, right? Like even in vanilla sex, you are fantasizing. I'm reading that other person's face. I'm interpreting their moans to mean something. I like this, or do more of this, right? I'm imagining what the other person's desire is for me, right? Because they're enthusiastic. Or maybe I'm thinking about someone else. Right? Or I'm thinking about something else that's helping me maintain or finish. Right. So this happens, and I think there's a bit of guilt and shame around that because it's like we want to be connected. We want to be sharing a state of consciousness together. That's not possible. But what is possible is to share the fantasy. Right. So once you open that up and you say, what are you interested in? You begin to collaborate on a fantasy. So it's no longer I'm interpreting your moan to mean I like this or more of this. It turns into dialogue. Do you like that? Right. And that starts to get a little bit sexy and erotic. And then from there, you can begin to build a connection with somebody where you're collaborating together on this fantasy. And that's where role play really starts to come in. If you recognize that all sex is fantasy, then lean into it because you know or you'll realize the things that really help get you off, right? In this way, sex equals fantasy equals you being less alienated from your own fantasy, more connected with the other person to a shared collaborative experience of a fantasy. Ideally, you'll have these discussions before engaging with somebody so you can begin to arouse each other, to share the kinds of fantasies that you like, and to build a sort of storyline. And once you got this grip on what the person's desire is, what your desire is, I want to be a toy, I want to be used, I want to be objectified, I want to feel close to you. And then what the person's boundaries are. Like, I like being called daddy but not mommy. I like being called a good toy but not a good girl. You can, spit on this part of my body but not my face. Right? Once you have these parameters, then you got scene building. You're like, okay, where do we go from this? What kinds of things arouse you? You lean into the role play. You build characters, scenes. And once you have a sort of established pattern, then you can begin to improvise a little bit. Because you kind of know where not to go and you know where to really lean hard and be like, okay, what if this a little bit? What if this a little bit? And you might run into some mistakes. You'll sometimes say the wrong thing. And you can either read that person's expression as like, that didn't work for me. Or they could explicitly tell you, especially if you have a very open line of communication. And it's not going to like end your performance to hear that something was, off kilter. Then you could do it during. Or you just debrief at the end and be like, okay, I noticed that this landed for you. You were really into this. Is that right? And the person's like, yeah, this I liked, but you missed how much I like this other thing.
Right. Okay.
Okay, and what didn't work this time? So I think being creative with role play is recognizing sex being a fantasy in general. And then the other part that I said was that sex is predominantly psychological. And what I mean by that is that most of the arousal is not going to be physiological. Yes, your body feels good when touched in particular areas and when you experience stimulation. But stimulation alone is not sufficient for the full bodily engaged experience of sex. The psychological elements both help you get aroused, stay aroused, and finish. So playing into the psychological territory is really where role play is intended to engage all of that arousal and maintain it and help you sustain and finish and all that for whatever your interests are. This is why I enjoy role play, because I enjoy the psychological aspects of it, right? I think sometimes more than the physical, more than the hit you with a stick.
Yeah.
I'll hit you with a mental stick.
Okay.
Oh.
Even better.
So let's move on to play parties and sex clubs. So for anybody who's interested in getting started, can you describe the atmosphere and how they work?
Yeah, the atmosphere thing depends on the place, the event, the people there. Some sex clubs will cater to swingers. Some will cater to kinksters. Some are like fetish events. But I think it's good to be able to, again, research what you're kind of interested in ahead of time and then attend. Or if you just want to try things out and see what, trial and error, see what
lands.
Yeah. So FetLife is one place where you can go for finding specifically kink and fetish events in a local neighborhood near you. You could search like sex clubs in the particular city that you're in, look at their website, see what events they have coming up, if they have workshops and other things like that. It's also good to see if they have explicitly like on their advertising material if they talk about consent, or on their website if they talk about consent, or if you go to an event, they send you an email with something about consent. When you get there, is there talk about consent at this potential play party or sex club that you go to? Because that could be indicative of what parameters they put in place for your safety and the safety of others. A lot of events will combine some kind of social element to it. So there might be a bar area, there might be a dance floor, there might be a lounge where no sex is happening. So it gives newcomers a chance to meet people and to hang out in a space where there isn't going to be sex. I think people will generally be cruising at these events, so they'll come up to you, then you might get an invite. Hey, want to play? Want to, do something? Yeah.
Hey, want to do something?
Want to do something? Yeah. And then you can observe other people doing something.
Yeah. One thing I did want to add to that is like for us, a lot of the ways that we found these things have kind of just been through like networking as well, like getting to know the right people. Networking, sexual networking, honestly, is like a part of the game a little bit. It's like just like getting to know people. And I think like part of that, it's like sexual networking. It's like
Can I tell you what came to mind?
Yeah, tell me.
Creating a paddle with a business card printed into it so that when you get spanked, you have the business info on your ass.
That's good. We should try that.
Hello, dragons. I'm here
There you go.
asking for $50,000. Mark Cuban, please bend over for this demonstration.
A lot of like really powerful business people like being submissive.
Of course.
That's the stereotype, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
We must assume. We must.
We must
We
assume
need to
that
assume.
Mark Cuban is a sub. What I was going to say is like for us, it's kind of much of it has started through our connection with Field. Either like making your own personal connections on the app or like going to their socials and meeting people and being like, this is what I'm interested in. You know anything about this? What do you think are the do's and don'ts around like etiquette for sex parties?
We know at this point, hopefully, no means no, right? Any no should always be a no and not negotiated. Hesitancy should also be treated as a no. It's in your best interest to just say, it looks like you're hesitating a little bit, so I'm going to treat this as a no for now. And if you do feel more confident about wanting to engage with me, please come and find me.
Yeah, that's good advice. I like that.
Yeah. Which also brings me to this notion, like, don't ask the same person again. If you got a no once, respect your no. Thank you for setting your boundaries, and just wait for that person to come to you if they decide they want to. The other thing is, if you go to a play party, you might be watching people play. Try to keep a nice distance. Don't get right up into their business.
Yeah.
Along with that is, like, don't make weird noises or talk loud or have full ongoing conversations where somebody's already playing. Definitely don't interrupt their scene and ask to join, and definitely don't start touching them. Right? Don't use other people's toys or implements without asking.
Yeah,
if you are using other people's toys and you've asked, put a condom on any toy that you can put a condom on. Wash toys between use and between partners. Also wash your hands and your mouth. When approaching a couple, speak directly to the person that you're making the request to, not their partner. You can speak to both of them, but make sure that whatever request you have for play is to the person that you're intending to play with, without necessarily asking permission from their partner unless that's part of their dynamic and they ask you to.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask, this is like a problem that we've been running into a fair bit from other people, is we're finding when it's like a group sex dynamic, someone will come up and just ask one person, can I join? This broad question, right? And it's like, okay, how am I supposed to give you, what am I agreeing to right now? What does can I join mean? What are you asking to do? I can't give consent on behalf of all of these people. Sometimes I feel a bit awkward in those situations though. I'm like, I don't know, like what do you recommend that the person being asked says in that situation, and like B, what should the other person actually be asking in that situation?
The first thing I'm thinking of is like if there's a group play situation that started, don't ask to join something like that, because then you are putting people in an awkward position. I think when asking a group, you're waiting to hear a no from any one person, because that means no overall. If one person's uncomfortable, then it's not happening.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, you can talk to your groups and people before you start playing as well, as a protocol. Like, hey, if anybody asks to join, is there anybody here who feels uncomfortable with that? Because their no will be a no for the group. I think people are just uncomfortable saying the no.
Yeah.
So maybe there could be a designated,
No person.
The one who feels most comfortable.
Yeah.
Delivering the no. It's much harder to come up with a scenario in which that's a yes, right? Because then the whole group has to stop what they're doing. Everybody has to consider, like, do we let some, well, I'm assuming it's a stranger, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's
Typically
somebody
it's
you know.
been strangers, yeah.
And then assess the situation. It's different if somebody wants to use the same space you're in.
Yeah.
You're like, can I use that space over there? And then you're okay with that? Sure. That can happen during play, and that's the nature of being in play settings, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, to join your situation,
Maybe just don't ask.
Just don't.
well, but you're going to be asked. So in those situations, if you're not comfortable,
Yeah.
say the no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So many of us grew up with very little understanding of consent and sexual boundaries. And I'm wondering if, for our listeners, you could provide us your philosophy around consent and how one should operate in settings like sex clubs, but also how this can translate to one-on-one dynamics.
My consent philosophy is something like wanting to make the other person feel comfortable enough to say no, and to encourage that. And it comes from this thing that I've heard in the sex positive communities, which is something like hearing your no makes me more confident or makes me trust your yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of the consent talks that happen before play parties will get people to exercise saying no specifically, because it is a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Right? It's hard to reject somebody.
Yeah.
And it's also hard to accept rejection gracefully.
Yeah.
So the answer to a no could be, thank you. I appreciate you honoring your boundaries, right? Ideally, I want any of my potential play partners to fully embrace the freedom of the decision that they have before them. With freedom also comes the ability to accept the responsibility of what happens. Without freedom, it's really hard to accept the responsibility of our choices. So if somebody uses manipulative tactics, so you like whittle that person down, you're persistent, you negotiate, you coerce, and then finally that person gives in. What they've been holding, they give away, which is what you want. In a scenario like that, that person may not feel they fully embrace the freedom of that choice, and then cannot accept the responsibility for what happens to them in a lot of ways. And this is why people can feel violated and feel traumatic things come up, right? Is because they recognize that they said yes, but they weren't in a position where no was encouraged, right? Or where they were comfortable enough to say no without fearing additional consequences. So in this way, I think that consent can help us embrace freedom as well as responsibility. And that's important for you, because what happens to you, if you can take some responsibility for that, it really helps to undo a lot of the potential trauma that comes along with that. Right? Freedom is one of the most terrifying things, right? When we fully look at a choice and we know that we have the freedom to make it, it can be very terrifying, because a lot of the times we fall back into that thing, like I was saying earlier, we want to be in the erotic situation which we have no choice. We want to be, put in a position where it's not our fault, right? But that turns you into a victim. That turns you into a person who doesn't have control in that situation. And even if that's a strong fantasy, the reality of that is probably not something you're going to enjoy. And it's probably going to be traumatic.
I gotta say, like, having done both, where like I was trying to put myself in those situations where I was just uncomfortable for like the thrill and excitement of it, to now doing it safely with people who I trust and feel like really comfortable with. And I know if I freeze around like setting a boundary with like a stranger, they can like see that in me and then like step in and like, you know what I mean? And like knowing that I'm like playing in a really safe way, I think it just feels so much better. And like you can still do those things and have those levels of excitement. You can even get even deeper with it because you're doing it in a way where it's like you're really present and you're also connecting more with people while you're doing it. And you know that all of the people around you feel like safe and good too.
Absolutely. Consent is the key here to be able to give you that sense of control, right? And with that freedom and responsibility and that control, it's like the erotic situation becomes something manageable rather than something that happened to you, right? Because again, the things that happen to you is hard to take responsibility for that. So consent is important for self-preservation, not just for taking care of other people. If I have a good consent game, then I know that I can withstand the experiences that I get into. Of course, terrible things can still happen and people can breach my consent, but I have a stronger grasp on myself and the things that I want and how I want them to happen with me, to me, because of me.
Is there anything that you want to butt plug for our audience?
I do have the podcast I haven't done in like 2 years. It still exists. So
And it's still good.
Intellectual Erection is that podcast.
Beautiful.
The other thing I did was art, erotic art stuff. Aesthetic.erection on the gram. There's erotic tarot deck that I made. There's all sorts of erotic.
Ooh, yes, the
imagery.
tarot deck.
Where can people buy the tarot deck?
If you go to the Instagram aesthetic.erection, there's a link there in the bio for Etsy, and my Etsy shop is Aesthetic Erection Art, and there's the tarot deck there. And then I just started working on something. It's a blog, and it's called All Death Has Dreams. The Instagram exists, All Death Has Dreams, and the website, alldeathhasdreams.com, is where the blog is hosted. And it's a critical, existential, and disordered blog.
Thank you so much, Pat, for joining us on today's episode. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you for all the butt plugs for our audience. Look under your seat. You can find a butt plug there.
Is that why this chair's so comfortable?
That's why I've been enjoying myself this whole time.
I brought my own chair. Anyways, thank you guys for having me. It was nice chatting with you. Good laughs, good times.
That's everything that we have for you today. And if you want to dive deeper into the world of polyamory with Yaz, we actually have 2 episodes on it. The most recent one will be the video on the left. And if you want to dive even deeper into that, we have the first 2 links in the description. That will be part 1 and part 2 to the polyamory episodes. Make sure that you subscribe and leave a like. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, make sure to leave us a 5-star review because it really does help the podcast out. That's everything that we have. And until next time, peace.